Johnny. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, everybody. Thank you, Tommy. Hello, welcome to the book launch for the Politics of Nordsploitation. I'm Johnny Walker, and somewhere else on your screen is my series co-editor, Dr. Austin Fisher from the University of Bournemouth. We established the Global Exploitation Cinemas series with Bloomsbury Academic in 2015. Since then, we have published 4 volumes. We have a 5th and a 6th coming out hopefully by the end of the year. And we have a further 3, I think, on the horizon. And whereas, and this is by no means any what am I trying to say? There are other book series that publish a lot more books than we do. And Austin and I feel that with the series, we really do want to emphasize quality over quantity. And as Pietari and Tommy will be able to attest to, the peer review that we do is very, very rigorous, and we stand by that, because a lot of work that appears in this area, there is a risk there that it's not particularly rigorous. And with a series like Global Exploitation Cinemas, we really wanted to put revisionist historiography right at the front and center of what the series is all about. So we're very delighted that that the authors chose our series to publish the Nordsploitation book in. So yeah, so it started in 2015. Our first volumes were published in 2016. And since then, the series has been going from strength to strength, I'd like to say. So Austin is going to chat a little bit about the volumes that we've published thus far, and then we will move on to Tommy and Pietari's short presentation, and then have a panel discussion. So Austin, my esteemed colleague, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Johnny. Yeah, so one of the things we were trying to do with this series was to get away from the kind of the cult reading of exploitation cinema that became quite dominant from the mid-90s onwards, and kind of look instead at historical, political, industrial histories, thinking about how these exploitation film movements have connected with the politics of their eras. And so one look at the title of the book that we're here celebrating will tell you how well it fits into our series. And I've just got the list of all the other books in front of me here, and they are diverse. We'd like them to be even more diverse, I think, but we've got a book called Exploiting East Asian Cinemas. We've got a book coming out on the Mad Max effect, so talking about Oz-sploitation. We have 2 books about the history of adult cinema and fandom around adult cinema in the USA. We've also got one on the exploitation films around the Vietnam War that emerged and commented on the Vietnam War beneath the surface of the more mainstream Vietnam genre. And we've got industrial histories of distribution and production of exploitation films. We've got one coming out on the X rating in British cinema as well in a couple of years. So we're always on the hunt for historically and politically informed studies of exploitation films. And thankfully and conveniently, we are now celebrating one such very well-informed study of a particular kind of exploitation that has been very understudied, I think, in recent years. So we will hand over on that note to Pietari and Tommy, and before we move into the Q&A.
Thank you, Austin. I will share my screen here. So me and Pietari will briefly cover 4 areas and give a few examples of what we mean with Nordsploitation. But we can start with what is Nordsploitation. This book deals with exploitation films, and the encyclopedia definition is: an exploitation film is a film that attempts to success financially by exploiting current trends, niche genres, or lurid content. Exploitation films are generally low-quality B movies. They sometimes attract critical attention and cult followings. However, the 5 Nordic countries have had a different relationship with the exploitative ingredients such as violence and gore, and as a consequence, a very different understanding of exploitation film as a concept. The 2 dominant factors for these relationships are film censorship and film financing, both of which have forcefully limited the existence of exploitation film in the Nordic countries. A definition of Nordsploitation is therefore, Nordsploitation consists of largely marginalized films produced in the 5 Nordic countries that exploit violence or other transgressive material in order to make some money or to take a stand against the culture of harsh film censorship that all Nordic countries has upheld well into the new millennia. And one example of this is blood tracks. National cinema histories have effectively written out a huge range of films that have contributed to shaping Nordic national film cultures. Nordic film history has, as a consequence, focused on the concept of national cinemas, dependent on 3 factors. First, films have not been exportable to markets outside the region. 2, state influence coordinates the production of cinema as a national project based on closely guarded notion of artistic relevance. And 3, the films produced in these contexts exhibits a national quality that is distinct from American films. However, in the Politics of Nordsploitation, we have turned this perspective upside down, studying films that are meant for export, films that are produced without state support, and films that have a transnational quality that mirrors American films in complex and subversive ways. One example of this is the slasher film Blood Tracks, directed by Swedish exploitation maverick Mats Helge Olsson, who made action and horror films for nearly 10 years in the woods outside of Lidköping in the 1980s, far away from the film center in Stockholm. This film is not mentioned even once in the annals of Swedish film history, despite the fact that it reached larger audiences than most other Nordic films made in the 1980s. Furthermore, Blood Tracks was not promoted as a Swedish curiosity, rather the opposite, as everything Swedish, such as language, location, and names, were Americanized. In the US, it was even marketed with the sticker from the makers of A Nightmare on Elm Street. This due to the fact that Mats Helge Olsson's previous film, The Ninja Mission, had been distributed by New Line Cinema, that of course produced the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. Nordic exploitation differs from American exploitation and exploitation in large European countries such as Italy and Spain, which dominates the scholarship on exploitation cinema. One significant difference is the use of periodizations, which does not match its Nordic counterparts. Eric Schaper has, for example, identified the period 1919 to 1959 as classical exploitation in the US. And other scholars have identified the period 1960 to 1980 as the area of new or classical exploitation, while the period after 1980 has been of less interest. However, Nordic exploitation functions on a different timeline compared to American and European exploitation cinema. For that reason, we have chosen to work with a longer historical perspective that includes an early period, the 2 classical periods, but also, due to the delay in Nordic genre and exploitation film that they experienced, a heavy focus on post-1980 films production, and especially with a focus on films in the new millennia. The purpose for adopting such a long historical timeline is twofold. First, a historical overview is necessary to be able to explain the similarities and differences in the periodizations of Nordic exploitation cinema within these 5 distinct film cultures. Second, it provides a recourse to explain the specific development of Nordic exploitation film in relation to its international and contemporary competitors, especially as conventions and cultural status of genre and exploitation films are often blurred in Nordsploitation. Generally, exploitation films or genre films which exploit violence or gore are relatively uncommon in Nordic countries before 1970. Much due to film censorship, which was not abolished well into the new millennium in the Nordic countries, with the exception of Denmark, who abolished film censorship for adults in 1969. However, there have always been films that quite shamelessly exploited sex or violence for profit in the Nordic countries. One early example is Katastrofen, photographed by Charles Magnusson, who, thanks to this film, was hired as the CEO of Svenska Bio, which under his management became Svensk Filmindustri, the biggest and most successful film company in Swedish film history. On April 15th, 1908, a small canal boat capsized in the harbor of Gothenburg, drowning nearly 30 passengers. Magnusson rushed down to the accident site and managed to film the salvage activities, including the macabre recovery of the corpses. The film then had its premiere at Magnusson Cinemas in Gothenburg the same evening. Katastrofen was eventually printed in a large number of copies and shown all over Sweden. In fact, the film was completed with further material from the salvaging of dead bodies and distributed for another round. In 1936, Magnusson's employee, Anders Karlsson, was interviewed about the film, and he said, quote, "The salvation was difficult and took a long time. There were divers, people, and boats, and for each corpse that was raised, Magnusson was there and took pictures. It was one of the ghastliest films I have ever seen, with corpse after corpse, but it did great. An additional 70 copies were sold all across Europe, and the order telegrams flowed in. Send me another 40 meters of corpses, one telegram requested. Several large Nordic film companies, including the Danish Nordic Film Company, benefited from practices like these, which created a financial base for the expansion into larger and more reputable productions, as well as the opportunity to expand internationally. So over to you, Pietari.
Thanks, Tommy, and thanks, Johnny and Austin, as well, for the really kind introduction. So my internet's a bit problematic today, so if I bomb out, we can take over, but let's hope it continues okay for this. So instead of going through the book chapter by chapter, I think what I will do is I'll outline some of the overarching categories we use the book to effectively deal with this, well, 100 years of film history in 5 different countries, and film histories that in many ways are transnational and expand well beyond the Nordic region. So the overarching approach we take in the book is to categorize these films into 2 categories. So on one hand, we have more localized forms of exploitation that aim dominantly at domestic markets. I'll explain that concept in a bit more detail in a minute. And the second concept that we have is globalized exploitation. So this sort of a local global paradigm is the underdriving factor that we more or less use to organize the book. So I'm just going to explain the idea of localized exploitation first of all. So these are films that might not be seen as authentic exploitation in most countries. So they might be seen as exploitative in their specific Nordic context because they might be exploiting national norms, or they might be using genres of filmmaking that were not normally predominant within this context. So there's a political economic underpinning to a lot of why we're categorizing certain films as exploitation. So it might not be about using violence, gore, or sex to do that, but it might be about the fact that they stand outside the norms of the industrial context of each specific setting. And to understand this, we need to look at them in an institutional context. So in the Nordic countries, they are effectively small nation cinemas. So the idea there is that these films, that films produced in this context will be reliant on domestic funding from the national film institutes, which are funded by public money, so effectively tax money. So the idea of public taxes funding violent or transgressive films is a problem in many ways when you look at that from a cultural political angle. So this is one of the other underpinning factors that we use to categorize exploitation. This idea that when you produce a genre film in a country like Finland, it might be seen as exploitative because it's using a commercial, popular form of filmmaking that is using tax money to do that. So that in itself becomes exploitative of the wider political economy of the Finnish cinema context at that time. Another category that we might focus on is reception or audiences. And one of the key ideas Tommy's already mentioned here is the fact of censorship. So in the Nordic countries, outside of sex, which wasn't really, so sex and nudity were not censored more or less in most of the Nordic countries in any heavy way at all, but violence and gore were massively problematic. So Finland, Sweden, and Norway in particular used to have extremely strict censorship regimes in place. And this led to a massive death of, for example, a lot of genre filmmaking. So for example, in Finland, all the Friday the 13th films were completely banned in the 1980s. So that in a sense opens up a gap in the market for domestic filmmakers to produce films that might fill that gap. So in many ways, lots of the domestic localized exploitation films are domestic productions aiming for domestic audiences. Can I get the next slide? I have to keep repeating that as well because only one person controlling this. Yeah, so here's a couple of examples of localized exploitation. But the first one there on your left is a film from 1984 made by maverick filmmaker Visa Mäkinen in rural Finland. It's effectively a Finnish version of the contemporaneously popular action film or crime film genre, and with a bit of kind of Italian sleaziness incorporated into it as well. The other film on your right is the Finnish slasher film Moonlight Sonata, Kuutamo Sonaatti, and that's effectively a variation of something like Friday the 13th or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but set in snowy Finland. So in any other context, these films would be more or less mainstream genre filmmaking. In 1980s Finland, the fact that they are Finnish productions incorporating genre elements that are in many ways outlawed by domestic cultural and economic powers makes them exploitative of the context of the time. So, the idea of having a Finnish slasher film in itself is a cultural political statement that capitalizes on the fact that there aren't, for example, Friday the 13th films or Texas Chainsaw Massacres being circulated in Finland at that time. So in that sense, films like these are able to capitalize on gaps in the markets to effectively find a reason for their own existence. Next slide, please, Tommy. So we can probably skip through this quite quickly. So the underpinning of this is what Mette Yurts and Duncan Petrie have been writing about. So this idea of small nation cinema and how filmmaking in small nation context is heavily reliant either on public subsidies from domestic film institutes like in the Nordic countries, or they have to, in many ways, engage with international and transnational forces. So there's a greater dependency on external markets, like yours and Pietari argue there. Next slide, Tommy, please. And this leads to a bunch of films that we call globalized exploitation films. And these are massively wide-ranging. So they cover anything from the 2012 Finnish blockbuster Nazi exploitation spectacle Iron Sky that uses crowdsourcing and cutting-edge visual effects to effectively use a Finnish version of a blockbuster film, to Rennie Harlin, who's made Hollywood films like My Heart 2 and Cliffhangers. First film, Arctic Heat, that's effectively a variation of the kind of Missing in Action, Rambo, First Blood Part 2 kind of action film of the mid-90s. But in this case, instead of having Chuck Norris, we have his son, Mike Norris, which might not compensate for many of the audiences at the time. What we do have here is a Finnish version of an American film produced in English that aims for international markets. So both Iron Sky and Arctic Heat qualify for this sort of exploitation, where they're effectively being able to use the fact that they are Finnish whilst they are globalized in their scope and some of their funding arrangements to widen up their markets because of that. Other films that we might deal with are, for example, a lot of Lars von Trier's films like The House That Jack Built, starring Matt Dillon there, or the Norwegian, again, Nazi exploitation film Dead Snow, that again uses a lot of genre conventions from international horror cinema, but localized within a Norwegian context. So what we're seeing here is a constant interplay between nationness, localization, transnational dynamics, and a global marketplace. And in many ways, these films capitalize and exploit those sort of relations for their visibility and their existence. And I'm kind of covering lots of ground here in really brief terms, but the key underpinning this, underneath our categorization of these ideas in the book, is that you see these films as exploiting both domestic localized contexts and globalized markets. Can I get the next slide again, please? So, in many ways, what we're seeing here is a form of globalized exploitation that's able to operate outside of the traditional confines of the nation, but use that nationness, especially when they're marketed internationally. So something like Iron Sky, Arctic Heat, grew from the fact that there were Finnish versions of blockbuster films, so Finnish versions of Chuck Norris films effectively. And that, in a sense, gives them something different to sell to an international audience. So again, they're exploiting a wide variety of cultural registers here. Next slide again, please. At the same time, whilst we see lots of these sort of relatively mainstream-based filmmaking that exploit cultural registers and the political, economic, cultural system in place in these Nordic countries, we do have more traditional types of exploitation in the book as well. So, for example, we talk about a filmmaker from Norway called Reinert Kiel, who's been making these really low-fi, low-budget exploitation films like The Whore from 2009, which is effectively a Norwegian version of I Spit on Your Grave, or the Finnish film Bunny the Killer Thing that you kind of see on the right there, which is a trauma-like exploitation film of taste boundaries, but also what's achievable within the confines of Finnish cinema. So these sorts of more traditional or orthodox exploitation films also exist within these countries, but they tend to be operating on a slightly different register from the more globalized and localized films we were discussing earlier. So the key point I think that comes out of this all is that Nordsploitation is massively complex. There's a huge variety of filmmaking styles and a huge variety of cultural politics going on underneath them. But for us to understand these sort of films as part of a cohesive whole is challenging. The point is that it really does highlight that in the Nordic countries, we don't only see the kind of charismatic Ingmar Bergman type of filmmaking, that there's a whole load of undercurrents and cross currents within these national film industries that are hugely complex and complicated and reflect the globalization of many of these national film industries in complex ways. So I don't know if there's another slide anymore here, Tommy, but I think we finished with that. Yeah, so there's Bunny the Killer thing for you. And I think we can, but the image speaks for itself, I think, in some ways. So yeah, and we can, I think, now move on to the panel discussion that I think Austin and Johnny might chair, and we've got Moffat and Isak Thorsen joining us on that as well. So I'll hand over to you, Ben.
Okay, thank you both very much for that. Very, very interesting. If you don't mind, I will start off with a question, if that's okay, and then it can ripple through the panel. One of the things that is immediately apparent from the presentation that you've just given is that whereas when one thinks of exploitation cinema today, the notion of exploitation cinema tends to be grounded within European and American cinema. As you mentioned, Italian exploitation cinema of the 70s and 80s, and the Friday the 13th movies were mentioned. I guess my question is, why haven't the exploitation films of the Nordic countries entered that discourse in the same way? Like, people will celebrate the films of Lucio Fulci, for instance, but Nordic filmmakers typically do not get a slice of that pie. And I'm just wondering why you think that is. If that's all right.
Yeah, fascinating question. Thanks, Johnny. So, well, there's a number of reasons. Again, we're talking about 100 years of history, but if we're talking about some of the examples that I showed, that reason could be that they are quite not great films in many ways. Well, neither are most of the Friday the 13th films for that, but there's a certain kind of low to exports. Can you hear me? I think my internet is cutting out.
Okay.
You can probably hear me.
It's okay. You're dipping a little bit, but it's fine.
Okay. Yeah. So one of the reasons there is that a lot of these films, in some ways, they're not great quality, but there's also a real kind of focus on local markets. So traditionally, Finnish films really haven't traveled at all across even the Nordic countries. So the only ones that have managed to do that are the kind of Kaurismäki films. So, but that shouldn't preclude, these sort of films from getting that sort of attention abroad. But I think it's in many ways that there hasn't been substantial investment in getting them seen outside of Finland. And if we're talking about something like the Fulci films, for example, that's one of the reasons why they were able to travel across national boundaries so easily was because they were so excessive in some levels, but there was also like a certain type of quality and institutional context to them that allowed that. So, the kind of Italian cinema in the 1970s and early 80s had a certain reputation that Nordic cinema really didn't have outside of the Nordic countries. So that there wasn't that sort of investment, I think, from the filmmakers themselves or from the cultural institutes that underpinned a lot of this production to anyways even think about getting these promoted outside of these borders. So it's a lack of support and a lack of visibility, I think, for the type of films that were being produced here. So, for example, a lot of the Nordic sexploitation films did travel massively because there was a demand for that sort of films because the reputation that had been built for them. But for a lot of these Nordic films, were either weren't enough of them to make a cycle, for example, and there wasn't really any real investment behind it. I can hand that over to Tommy as well, and maybe Isak as well, as he's involved in some of this as well, might say a few things.
Yeah, I can add some to that discussion. I think one big reason is that the Nordic filmmakers didn't have the opportunity to make films like Fulci for 70 or 20 years. They made a few films. There are a few exceptions. Mats Helge Olsson made films for 10 years, and Visa Mäkinen made films for 10 or 15 years. But the majority of filmmakers made 1 or 2 films. And when we talk about Mats Helge Olsson films, a few of his films have reached some sort of cult status, but the majority of his films are, to use in one word, they are shit. They are really, really bad, and they're so bad that they almost turn out to be like Edward D. Wood's films or something like that. So I think, but the major reason is that most filmmakers just made a few films and nobody knows who they are. And the exception here is like Pietari said, is exploitation, but that is not the area of our book.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to comment on that? No pressure. Maybe there's a little bit of pressure.
Should I say something? Okay.
By all means.
Yes. First of all, Peter and Tommy, congratulations with your book. It's wonderful. It's really strange not to have a glass of wine together or something to celebrate it, probably. And now we're sitting here in this strange virtual reality. But anyway, congratulations with the book. And I also have to say thank you very much for inviting me to this book launch. I'm very honored. I enjoyed reading your book, and I also think it's very interesting to take these French subjects. And I also have a couple of questions, of course, for your definitions of exploitation. But just to return to your question, Johnny, about why are these films not celebrated? I think one point that has already been mentioned, some of the sexploitation films, or the Danish ones, which I know a little bit about, they are still some of the most sold films on DVD in Denmark. If you can kind of deduct that could be some kind of celebration of it. But another point is that there are not that many exploitation films to kind of celebrate. I think Tommy mentioned Mats Helge Olsson, and I think that you don't have these kind of. I think that was a wonderful chapter in your book to read about, which is this maverick who just kind of produces films, uses the system, and as Tommy say, this is crap films, but he just keeps on producing. And that's a wonderful story. You have similar figures in Denmark who are like independent producers, directors, but they make comedies and they make serious films as well. So I think that's one of the reasons we don't have that many exploitation films. And in this context, with your book, the sexploitation films are not included. So that's one of the reasons.
Thank you very much. Austin, do you have any questions that you want to ask before we jump into the Q&A?
I do, but I think we should invite Kate to speak first, because I think she's the one panelist who hasn't yet spoken. So I'll hold my questions back.
Apologies, Kate.
No worries. Thank you guys for having me, and thank you for the book and the presentation, folks. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I suppose, I don't know if it's probably not an easy question to answer, but would you characterize Nordsploitation as a type of production practice in any sense of the word? I mean, I suppose it's a complex question because it's so diverse, but I don't know if you would have any answers to that.
I mean, do you want to go for that? I'm happy to take that. Thanks, Kate. So Kate's input was really useful in the book itself as well. So she was providing lots of insight into some of these practices. So, and yeah, thanks for that. I'd probably say that Nordsploitation is more of an overarching category for these types of films that are in many ways that stand outside cultural norms and the political norms of these countries as well. So that's the kind of, I think, overarching, this is more of a descriptive term rather than a mode of production, because what we are seeing here are multiple forms and modes of production. So something like the Helge Olsen films are really low budget, produced independently, literally in the middle of nowhere with the same cast and crew, where they're actually using a factory kind of type of filmmaking, whereas something like Iron Sky is also 8 million euros, and it's got funding from Germany, Finland, and elsewhere, and crowdsourced funding. So there's different types of production or industrial context underpinning a lot of these films. But what is driving a sort of cohesive logic to them is this sort of complexity of categorizing themselves within the normative confines of what Nordic film or cinema is meant to be, and what each of these 5 countries' cinema histories are meant to be. So Nordsploitation is for us a kind of it's a marginalized or liminal form of practice within the kind of spaces of these national film industries. Yeah. Hope that answers some of that question.
I think it's particularly interesting how you're talking about the kind of the tension between the local, the global, the trans-Nordic, different countries being kind of somehow sharing common features across this book. And I think that's one of the most revealing things about this, is how we conceptualize the national within the context of exploitation. And it's something that's cropped up in our series as well. So we've looked at East Asian exploitation. We didn't look at one particular nation. So it's an interesting kind of regional focus rather than a national or a local focus. Kind of with that in mind, I do have a little question, which is, can you explain the significance of the front cover?
Yeah, I can take that question. The front cover is from the film The Ninja Mission by Helge Olsen. That is, it's a ninja film made in the woods of Lidköping, in the middle of nowhere. And a ninja in a Nordic context could be quite strange, and it is. But when you look at the actual context of the 1980s, when in Sweden, Finland, Norway, not in Denmark, and I don't know in Iceland, but in the 3 countries mentioned, ninjas was banned right off the bat. That is, if you had a ninja in the title or in the film, it was banned by the film censorship. That is one reason we wanted to have a ninja on the front cover, because this is not Nordic film at all. It's so far away from Nordic films you can come. But it's also in the context that ninjas were an example an example of how foreign influences infected Nordic film culture in the wrong way. That is through genre films in this case. And film censorship is also the common determinator for all Nordic countries, with the exception of Denmark, of course, who abolished censorship in 1969. But the interesting thing is, as Isak Thorsen said, there are not that many Danish exploitation films who concentrates on violence and gore. There are a lot of Danish sexploitation, of course, but not of violence and gore.
I have one further question, if that's okay, and then maybe we can sort of open it to a more general discussion, if that's all right with the panel. We've established thus far that a lot of the films under scrutiny here are, to quote Tommy, shit. However, I mean, what strikes me about that comment is that in recent years, certainly when scholars have attempted to investigate exploitation films, a lot of people seek to explore the extent to which the films themselves as texts are political or politically engaged or reflective of a particular cultural moment. And it's easy to do that when you're talking about competent filmmakers such as Toby Hooper or George A. Romero or Lucio Fulci or what have you. But by your own admission, these films are not very good. Does that mean by default that they aren't as textually rich as, say, other films in the exploitation tradition from other regions and nations?
Yeah, Tommy, did you want to go first? Or?
You can go first.
Okay. Yeah, really fascinating question, and yeah, probably again it's difficult to generalize because there's so many different styles and practices within these countries. But I'd probably say that sometimes, yeah, these films might not be massively rich in terms of looking at aesthetics or narrative styles or even the use of gore or violence. That's oftentimes Finnish or Swedish exploitation of violent film might only have a couple of instances of relatively minor violence, but that in the context of these countries becomes significant. So in that sense, it's almost like we're trying to, sometimes it's a matter of uncovering the significance of something that can be quite easily overlooked by the fact that they are Finnish or Swedish or Norwegian in that sense. So we can potentially make more of small instances in this context that might not, that could quite easily be, yes, overlooked in other contexts. But I'd say that there's also a different type of richness probably to this as well, in the sense that once you contextualize some of these shit practices within the context, within the wider production context in which they're made, they start to take on again more significance. So, for example, the Ninja Mission that the cover features is again not necessarily massively innovative in terms of how it's been made, or even its use of violence outside of a single scene. That's quite good, but it's about the fact that it's been made with minimal money in the middle of nowhere in an old abandoned factory that allows us to start to maybe contextualize that with what's going on in the wider picture of, let's say, Swedish cinema at the time. So these films, by default of what they're not, almost stand out for that fact, if that makes sense. So the fact that they don't look like conventional Swedish films is interesting and rich in a sense.
Yeah, and to add, yeah, most films are textually shallow. They are not much to analyze. But as we have shown in our book, these films have had a huge contribution to the development of Nordic genre film because they are inspired filmmakers to make genre films, which was, as Pietari said at the introduction, exploitative in itself during the 80s and 90s in Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Iceland and Finland. So for that reason, they have had an impact on a cultural sense. But textually, there are a few films you could analyze and perhaps make into cult movies, and some are cult movies. But on the whole, they are quite shallow.
There's another kind of pattern here as well, which is to do with this wider historical developments of probably Nordic genre filmmaking, in the sense that the fact that the 1980s, when people were making genre films, they were more or less just marginalized or castigated for the fact that they were even trying to make genre films in this context. But what we've seen since then in the next 2-3 decades up to the present moment is a massive amount of talent and industrial investment in Nordic genre film production precisely. So we're seeing a lot of the people that grew up on lots of these films that we've talked about already, the kind of Ninja Missions or Moonlight Sonatas and so on, and effectively growing up with that sort of heavy censorship and the kind of fandom that generates, and then using that to build their own careers and start making the kind of films that they were missing in their childhood in the 1980s, early 1990s. And that's now become quite a major cultural policy drive within a lot of the Nordic film scenes, in the sense that there's a lot of investments, both cultural and economic, into producing genre films of precisely the kind that were more or less completely marginalized 40 years earlier. So that's one of those kind of interesting historical patterns that we've seen there.
Thank you very much, both. I think that's an appropriate time to open up to questions from other people.
Okay, can I make a comment maybe? Because I think it might be, it's just a little bit of what do you say, to nuance this a little bit, because you can say, like, I think one of the very, very interesting points you make in the book is this development from this kind of auteur, serious film, art film tradition that has been encouraged by the subsidizing schemes of the different Nordic countries to what we have today, which are more open to genre films and more popular films. And but I think it's important to stress, especially from a Danish viewpoint, as Tommy also mentioned, that not that many exploitation films done in Denmark, that there's been like this movement that the subsidizing schemes in Denmark, like the 50-50 scheme from the 80s, which opened up for like more commercial films and genre films. So my point is that there has been some institutional basis as well as some kind of craving for exploitative or genre films, but they have kind of, there's been like this kind of cross movement. So just because I could understand it, what you said a little while ago, as that like the exploitation films has kind of paved the way for the genre films, and I think that that might be a little bit exaggerated.
Was that a question or?
No, that was a comment.
Yeah.
But do you want? I have many questions, but okay.
Lars wants to ask.
Is that okay with a question now? Then, yeah. Okay. So when I read your book, it was very, very interesting. But what I wondered, because can you actually talk about the Nordic exploitation film as a kind of homogeneous entity? Because when I read the book, many of the cases are like Swedish or Finnish. They're kind of dominating, and I was just wondering, because we have different, as Tommy has mentioned twice now, the censorship rules are different, especially in Denmark, where everything was more or less set free for adults in 1969, and that also makes like there's a different kind of pressure of what films we are not allowed to see, which perhaps encourages the exploitation films. The subsidizing schemes are a bit different as well. I was very fascinated by, especially Mats Helge Olsson's way of kind of using the Swedish Film Institute's subsidizing schemes. And I think that's, so my basic question is, can you actually talk about this, the Nordic exploitation films as a homogeneous entity?
The short answer is no, you can't. but we are trying to, of course, do that based on similarities in the film financing system, and of course in the film censorship, which Denmark is an exception from. But Denmark, as you said, doesn't have so many exploitation films, perhaps because you could import exploitation film and actually show it on the cinemas, which we couldn't do in Sweden and Finland and Norway. But yeah, it's a problem to cram 5 countries together. But we think that we have found enough similarities to give a case of how the development have followed each other country by country. Denmark first, then Sweden, then Finland, then Norway. And Iceland is a little bit on the side because they don't make that many films. Do you want to comment?
There was a question from Lars, I think, as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Thank you, Tommy and Pietari and everybody else who has spoken. Just a question. There was a wave of Nordic exploitation that was very visible around 2010, in my opinion, at least, with Iron Sky, Cold Prey, Sauna, Dead Snow, etc. And this wave seems to have pretty much died out. I'm not sure if you agree with me, but you could comment on that. Could you explain why that wave maybe died out? And do you see a future for Nordsploitation in the coming decade? And is there a place for state-subsidized Nordsploitation in the Nordic and especially the Swedish film policy landscape, categorized mainly by gender politics? So a couple of questions built in there that would be interesting to hear your comments on. Thank you.
That's really fascinating. Thanks, Lars, for that. And yeah, lots to answer. I don't know if I will have time to answer everything about that. But yeah, so that's a good point to be making about the 2010s as a particular flashpoint, perhaps, for the type of Nordic exploitation to emerge. And it's part of this, I think, longer historical development patterns that we're observing here, which I think Isak and Tommy have been already addressing there. And potentially goes to answer some of Isak's concerns about the whole feasibility of the category of Nordsploitation as well. That's around the 2010s, there was all of these film policy and cultural policy drives with the title Nordic genre film or Nordic genre boost, were a couple of the incentives that were in place at that time. So that, in a sense, indicates that around this time, there was these films were seen as culturally respectable in a sense, or at least commercially lucrative in the ways that would, again, attract the kind of neoliberal, the interest of the kind of neoliberal policies of that particular historical moment. So in the sense that the whole idea of Nordicness is a film industrial development. So that even though there are 5 countries, they are all developing within certain kinds of institutional constraints, driven by the Nordic film and television funding that often does drive a lot of the transnational collaboration. That in itself, yes, congealed around 2010s, and underpinning that could have been, again, a lot, there's a lot to be kind of unpacked here, so I'll try to gloss over a lot of history really briefly, but it's to do with, for example, technology. So around early 2000s saw the incoming of digital technology into film production, which allowed, again, lots of people to produce relatively good-looking films with really little money at that point in time. So that, in many ways, allowed lots of these, fanboys of the 1980s and 1990s to start making films that were explicit genre or exploitation productions, and allowed them to, make them look good enough to be competitive at the domestic box office. And it's a part of a cycle of Norwegian slasher films that kind of started this in about 2005, and that then led to much more interest across all the Nordic countries in producing these types of films. That in itself then drove investment into these sort of productions, which allowed them more visibility, and then led to these cultural political incentives like the Nordic genre film boost and the Nordic film and television financing for Nordic genre film. There's a kind of wide compendium of factors came together around that time that allowed for the production of these sort of films to emerge. And again, the abolishment of censorship 10 years before that allowed these films to be as gory as they wanted to be and as excessive as they wanted to be. So there were none of those constraints at the time. So it's probably a historical compendium of factors that made this possible. But yeah, you're completely right about that as well. That is started to wane off quite a bit as well. So we're not seeing that level of interest or investment in this type of production anymore. a whole variety of factors again that could be underpinning this, and that again could be technological to some extent, and especially streaming media and the kind of the role that streaming media services play in gatekeeping a lot of this as well. So the kind of money that a Norwegian slasher filmmaker could make in the early 2000s isn't really feasible anymore in a streaming media environment. There's an endless amount of similar content coming from everywhere in a sense. So, and that's again has then snowballed into a lack of policy interest in that and lack of economic investment in that as well. So it's kind of a massive variety of factors come into play within this. I don't know if that answers that at all, if I'm just rambling really at this point in time.
Pietari and Tommy, I'll just ask you, do we have time for one more question, or do we need to wrap up exactly on the hour?
One more question is all right.
I think I saw Mariah had her hand up. Oh, she didn't. Oh, okay. In which case, we don't need to turn to her. Oh, Linus has.
Yes, hi. Hope you can hear me. I'm fascinated by the low budget theme here. And of course, that has many effects on the production, one of which is music. So I'm a musicologist, so of course I must ask that. Is that anything you've looked into?
We haven't looked particularly at music, but we talk about a few of the composers for these films because, for example, Mats Helge Olsson used the same composer for all his films, which is with the result that all films, all music in all the films sounds exactly the same. But no, we haven't really discussed the music, the role of music or soundtrack in the film, otherwise in the book.
Okay, thanks.
There's a couple of mentions of that. For example, lots of the prestige for some of these Finnish slashers in the 1980s came from them trying to emulate John Carpenter in the music score and things like that. So it's basic, simple kind of surface-based similarities. And the film that Tommy showed, the Blood Tracks, is effectively what might you call it, of a rock-based slasher film where you have rock bands being involved in slasher films.
Yeah, I forgot that one. Blood Tracks was made around the idea that they would promote the Swedish rock band Easy Action. So Easy Action is in that film with Kio Marcello and all the guys. So they made a film as the star attraction, but the problem was that Easy Action was an unknown Swedish band, which was signed to Warner Music, but they never broke through. So the cross-fertilization between film and soundtrack didn't work, actually.
Right. So I think rock bands are common. There's also a lot of use of synthesizers, like John Carpenter, and the Italian slashers, of course, used lots of synthesizers.
Well, on that note, there's a pun there. I'd just like to say, it's never a good pun if you have to point it out, right? I'd just like to say thank you very much to Tommy and Pietari, also our other panelists. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to everybody for attending the book launch. Just a quick plug on the Bloomsbury website. Type in Global Exploitation Cinemas and you'll see the full list of books. If there are budding authors here or established scholars and you'd like to submit a proposal, send us an email via the usual channels. We're always willing to discuss new projects. So I'm going to shut up and say thanks again to everybody, and have a very pleasant afternoon, and please do buy the book. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. Excellent. And thanks for Kate. Thank you.